Hey guys, real quick, I just wanted to take a quick second to tell you about the show's awesome sponsor, Anchor. Back in 2019, when I started this podcast, I didn't know much about podcasting at all. Luckily, I came across Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free, it has built in creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can also be heard on all the major platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. You can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started now.
Dozens of wildfires raging out of control in the West.
Gosh, we've had, 3 or 4 fires around here in the last month, and it's kind of getting scary.
2 million people under red flag warnings across 5 states: California, Idaho, Montana, Washington, and Oregon. The Bootleg Fire is the first official mega fire of 2021. It's burned more than 200,000 acres, doubling in size for 4 straight days, now nearly 7 times the size of San Francisco. And drought conditions in 94% of the West are making it all worse.
It has never been this low. It really, truly is unprecedented.
Lake Mead, only a third full, is lower than it's been since the 1930s. It's one of several depleted reservoirs across the Southwest.
Climate change has a very strong fingerprint on exactly what we're seeing right now at Lake Mead.
In the past decade, dangerous weather events have become more frequent and more extreme due to the climate crisis. Both the public and elected officials are only beginning to take the situation seriously. And there's one population in the US facing some of the worst climate threats who almost nobody is talking about: incarcerated people.
At that time that I was in the heat, it was a horrible experience. For 1 year, I sat there just dying.
What pains me the most is his life could be taken by a fire that he can't escape from.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another edition of the 805 Uncensored podcast, where we discuss politics, history, music, spirituality, and more. And this is episode number 52. If this is your first time tuning into the podcast, welcome and thank you so much. Tonight on the show, I have the great fortune of speaking with Desmond, the host of the Independent Thought podcast.
Hey, I appreciate you having me on the podcast tonight. My first time being here. My second time being here. My first time as a solo guest.
Right.
And so I'm excited about that. And yeah, also looking forward to having you on mine, and that's just the future. So
yeah, it's going to be dope. I've listened to a lot of your stuff, and you have fire content, I got to say.
Oh, thank you.
So first things first, before we dive into the main topic of the episode, can you tell my listeners a little bit more about yourself, your politics, and your podcast?
Yeah, so Independent Thought basically kind of just like sprouted up from just me and a friend, for the most part, just like watching the news on a day in and day out basis. This kind of went on for years. We would always have conversations about it. And we kind of just got into the mindset that we should like just create a podcast, which eventually became my podcast because he wasn't as interested once we kind of really got into things. And I think what I try to focus on for the most part is trying to put a scope onto issues that I feel like aren't being covered that well or aren't being covered at all. I'm definitely left leaning. I've never really given myself a true title. I don't know that I believe in them. And I also don't know exactly where to put myself. I know that I find myself on the left of basically most issues, if not all of them. But I've never gone through the sense of labeling myself. That's actually what kind of played into calling the podcast Independent Thought, not independent in the sense of like centrism, but independent in the sense that I did not feel connected to any label or to any party. I kind of felt I was independent from having to pick where I was on the political scale, I guess, more or less. But if you go like issue by issue with me, I find myself being pro most things that, you know, Bernie Sanders would talk about.
Yeah, right on. I think that's pretty awesome. So tonight on the podcast, we got a couple of pretty heavy topics. We're going to
Yeah.
be discussing mass incarceration and its relationship to climate change. So, you know, at first glance, some people might think at first, like, what the hell do these two things have to do with each other? But if you kind of put your thinking cap on and you take some extra time, it becomes quickly apparent, like the link between these two. And we're going to dive a lot into that. I've also got a scholarly article that I'm going to be referencing quite often in here. So I'll be sure to link that into the description and talk all about that as soon as I get to it. So, Desmond, I wanted to ask you first, what are some of the major climatic changes that you've witnessed personally in Montana over the years? I know that's where you're located.
You know, it's gotten a lot warmer here, and I don't. I mean, I'm sure that the data would back that up, but just from lived experience, it's gotten dramatically warmer in Montana since I've lived here. I've lived here since the year 2005, and when I first moved here, it was very common for there to be multiple weeks on end in the wintertime where it would get below zero for weeks on end. And when I moved here to Missoula, where I'm at currently, it's definitely a warmer part of Montana than where I lived at when I first got here, which is Great Falls, Montana. It definitely was a warmer area, being on the other side of the Great Divide, or the Continental Divide, excuse me. But it's also gotten warmer here too. Like in fact, just the last couple of years, it almost barely gets below zero at all. And I'm sure for someone who doesn't live in the north, you're probably like, "Oh my God, like doesn't get below zero." But when you live out here, that's kind of like one of the things that you get accustomed to, and it just doesn't really happen that often anymore. The amount of snowfall that we get has dropped dramatically. Getting blizzards was a normal thing in this state when I first got here, and they've like lessened year over year. And yeah, the amount of precipitation just seems to drop every year, which has a big impact for us in the summertime as well, because the snow cap that we would have on the mountains would then like run off during this time of the year and in the summertime, and that would lead to usually less fires, which
Mhm.
now, because we don't have the snow buildup, that we have been seeing drier seasons, more drought, more wildfires, and it has been relentless the last like 5-6 years now. We've been having just smoke filled summers. 2017, for instance, we had a summer that was so like smoky that you legitimately couldn't see like more than maybe like 100 feet in front of you. I mean, the whole town looked like a scene out of like Day After Tomorrow, or like the Dawn of the Dead. Like the sky was orange around here, which I'm sure that people in San Francisco could probably relate to from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's like Blade Runner 2049 in 2020.
Yeah. So it's been a stark change. It's been a stark change. I know that other people have, mentioned, I don't live up on the Blackfeet Reservation, but a couple hours north of here, they will also have been telling me about how some of the berries up there just no longer grow anymore. That used to grow just only like a few years ago. So we're seeing like changes in vegetation as well, just certain just native plants that can no longer seem to thrive in the same areas that they were thriving in just a decade ago. So yeah, without having like a table of data in front of me, I can just tell you just from lived experience that the change is definitely noticeable just to the everyday person. There's no way to escape it.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of major changes, obviously, in Southern California, dealt with a lot of the same wildfire issues. Um, I've also noticed the last few years, the wind speeds have increased. So we have more days with wind than we ever had before. Like we always had Santa Anas, but now like year round we have these 20, 30 mile an hour wind days. And then on some days too, it's like 85, 90 degrees. So
Mm,
any little spark causes a fire. And we've dealt with a lot of those. And then obviously just much less rain. And I've noticed a lot of precipitation whiplash, climate whiplash. So that means we have periods of extreme drought, and then, like the snap of a finger, we have flooding.
mm,
Very quick, sudden changes between extreme conditions. And that's
right.
only intensified over the years. And if you look at the data, it looks like that's only going to increase as time goes on in California. We're also I'm in the southwestern United States. We're dealing with something that's called a mega drought right now. A
Yeah, I
mega
saw that.
drought, Yeah, a mega drought, according to dictionary.com, is a drought that lasts 2 or more decades. So we've been tracking this since 2000. Lake Mead, in particular, have you heard about Lake Mead?
I haven't. No.
Okay, so it's a reservoir like outside of Las Vegas in Nevada, and that's where Las Vegas gets a lot of their water from, and I think some other major southwestern cities do as well. Might have to fact check me on that, but I'm pretty sure. Anyways, there's a noticeable bath ring where the water level used to be and now where it is now. And it's just
Right.
gone down and down and down over the years. And what scientists have found is this current mega drought that's taking place in the southwestern United States. It's actually the driest 22 period in the region since at least the year 800. And the years 2002 and 2021, they found were drier than any other years in nearly 300 years and were respectively the 11th and 12th driest years between 800 and 2021.
It's absolutely remarkable, and it's a shame that we constantly have to run into, those who want to find different ways to kind of deny that something is happening. But unfortunately, that's one of the factors that we're dealing with right now, is that there are some people who view this as a political issue, which I guess, we also run into when you think about the pandemic. It was like, people just want to make this, about politics versus, actually like interpreting what data we have in front of us. And it's unfortunately exacerbating this issue more than it should.
Yeah,
There shouldn't be
absolutely.
so much contention about just being able to see right in front of us what's happening.
It's really alarming. Where I live in Southern California, I think just in the last 100 years, the temperature here has increased by over 3.5 degrees. And that
Yeah.
doesn't sound like a lot to some people, but when you're talking about the average temperature, that makes a big difference. You know, one, two, three, every degree dries out the vegetation more and more and more.
No, absolutely. And I think just going back again, like, I mean, even if the average temperature wasn't affecting an individual and being like, oh, well, that doesn't bother me, so on and so forth. Well, when it accumulates into these massive like weather events, well, when I first got to Montana, I spent the years of like 2005 to 2011, or maybe even 2012, having, if there were fires in the state, I did not notice them. Like, it was like, I was like, oh, I would hear about a fire, and then I'm like, oh, okay. But it wasn't something that ever really like felt newsworthy. But kind of around 2012, when we first started seeing like fires becoming, I guess, stronger and more consistent,
Yeah.
like here in Missoula, where I live at right now, there was wildfire smoke in the city visibly every single day from like the middle of July to the end of September. It never lifted. It never went away. Like, it was, we breathed it in every single day. And I lived up on top of a hill. So I could like almost like drive into it every single day. And it's more or less been like that every year since then. And like, it does affect everything in one way, shape, or another. So the fact that so many people can turn a blind eye to and act like it's not a big deal, it really makes me wonder how someone could be that detached.
Yeah, I think I read a statistic recently that said the smoke emissions from wildfires over the last 20 years have been more concentrated for greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than car emissions have.
Yes, I read that as well. And it makes sense. It really does. I mean, when you
Yep.
have all of these acres burning, I mean, when you have a fire, when you're in a backyard, and you're just like, having like your own little like personalized, fire,
Hmm.
like you can tell that like after a while, that smoke kind of blowing in your face is a lot. Well, like here, we have entire forests that are on fire, and they'll like range for miles. I mean, last year in 2021, the state of Montana had almost 1 million acres burn. It's insanity. I mean, and that's just in 1 year. I mean, and we've been having this, like, again, this is happening year over year over year. I mean, these forests aren't growing back fast enough. And on
No,
top
the
of the
fire
fact that, like,
intensity too. Like we've always had
yeah,
wildfires in the West. It's the intensity of the fires that's so much different.
and the just the amount of them.
Yeah, the
You know,
amount of
so much
dry
so that's
days.
yeah, the amount of, firefighters that we have, they can't contain them, and then they grow even larger, and, and yeah, it's becoming unsustainable, and here in the state that I live in, we rank the highest in the nation for the number of properties who are at risk of wildfires.
Wow.
So it's not just affecting like people's, ability to breathe, it's affecting like your life, like your home, like where you,
Hmm.
so I mean it's dangerous all around. We really do need more people to kind of wake up to the realities that are going on with climate change in this country and the world, honestly.
Yeah, did you read that back in 2020, San Francisco actually had its first rain-free February since the Civil War?
I did not hear that, no.
I had to read that article like 3 times to verify that. That's incredible. And
Yeah.
if you know anything about California and the West in general, we get the vast majority of our precipitation in the winter,
Mm.
particularly January, February, and March for California. And so for San Francisco, a Northern California city, to not record a single drop of rain in February, it's unheard of.
Yeah, I didn't know that about California, about Northern California. But it tracks with what we're seeing over here. Like Montana, we're not that far away from California, I guess, in the grand scheme of things, even though it is like 1,000 miles from here. But the weather, I think that we are experiencing here is not that much different than what's experiencing over there. And a lot of times, not only do we have that kind of like that shared correlation, but wildfire smoke from California will come up here every year.
Yep.
Every year. Like we know when fires are burning in California because we usually have to deal with that too. So it's a relentless, thing that you have to deal with right now.
It's because in the summertime we have the sea breeze, and so the winds blow from west to east, and so they go straight towards you guys.
Yeah, it's fun times. We get the smoke from California, the wildfires, and I mean they're everywhere. I mean Oregon, Washington,
Idaho.
Idaho, essentially blowing
Yep.
in from British Columbia and Alberta. So yeah, they hit us from every angle. So
Yeah.
yeah, something definitely needs to be done.
What did you make of that Pacific Northwest heat wave? You know the one I'm
Uh
talking about where it hit like a
yeah,
hundred
yeah.
and
Portland saw triple digits. They had some like roads starting to crack last year.
yeah,
Um,
116 in Portland.
yeah, in Portland. I've actually personally never been over to Oregon, so I wasn't aware that they didn't hit triple digits. We hit triple digits here in Montana in the summertime.
Mhm.
We have extreme weather here. But
Yep.
that's nothing new. But yeah, hearing about that for Portland, and then seeing that they're normally like they don't break like 80s in the
Mhm.
summertime over there in Portland. Yeah, I mean, it's just another case in a long list of cases, right? I think was it Washington D.C. Was it a year or two ago? Was getting wildfire smoke from California. Like I know personally from living in the East Coast that never once happened when I was a kid. Like
Yeah, I
never
heard
once.
DC and New York City.
Right. I grew up right outside of Philadelphia. I never saw that once as a child. We had regular pollution there, you know, from the
Yeah.
from the plants and stuff. Yeah.
And it was, in that it was from that general area. It wasn't from 3,000 miles away.
No, no, definitely not. Definitely not.
Yeah, actually, this is really hard to believe, Desmond, but it's true. So the record-setting California drought that took place from 2011 to 2017 has actually been less intense than the current drought from 2020 to present.
Right. So we're seeing these major events just basically just like compound onto each other. And so as bad as one effect is when you have both of them combined back to back, we're seeing, ecological disaster. I mean, and the trickle down effect that's going to have, I mean, not just, with basically how it's affecting human beings, but also how it's affecting, the animals of these areas, how it affects the vegetation. I mean, there's so many different ripple effects that can essentially come from these disasters.
Yeah, something that I was thinking about back in 2020 and still now because the pandemic's still going is there was this sign that I saw. it was for like a wildfire evacuation zone. And then it also said, wear a mask. So it just like compounded this message inside your brain like, wow, we're dealing with two simultaneous crises at once. You know, we're dealing with a public health crisis with the pandemic, and then we're also dealing with a climate crisis all at the same time. And just seeing um, the evacuation zone right there, and then seeing pictures where people need to wear a mask, like that really stood with me. So basically, what I'm getting at is, since we're still dealing with COVID, which is a respiratory virus, smoke inhalation from these wildfires is a major issue.
Right.
And if you crunch the numbers and look at the data, a lot of the deaths in the Western United States from COVID took place right after these fires in September, October, you know?
Right. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, in a lot of ways, I mean, it is, from what we understood about COVID, um, I mean, it attacks your immune system.
Hmm.
And if you're breathing in wildfire smoke on top of your body having to combat this virus that's trying to infect it, especially around the time of the year, like when, during the seasonal change, that's when, typically people end up getting sick anyway, because your immune system drops from just the natural like reaction to the seasonal change.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the perfect storm of your body being, a little just too vulnerable to handle all of those things at once.
Hmm. Yeah, like outside of the Western United States, right? We're also seeing stronger hurricanes in the Gulf. Scientists are saying in 2022, this year, that we're supposed to have another above average hurricane season, like similarly
Yeah.
to 2020. And they think they said that, 6 storms are expected to impact the United States.
Yeah, and that's just another product of the warming weather, as because like we've known for a long time, even if you be a meteorologist, they give you this basic information is that the stronger storms come from the warmer water.
Yep.
So as temperatures rise, water temperatures rise, intensity of hurricanes.
Yeah, and then you also have sea level rise, which impacts the storm surge that comes
You
from
know,
the hurricanes. That's where the vast majority of the deaths come from.
yeah, I mean some of these cities, down in the Gulf, they weren't ready for this change. I mean, I know it's not as simple as packing up and moving, but man, I would get out of there. I mean, truthfully speaking, if you have the means, I think it might be time to leave that part of the
If you
country,
have the ability to
unfortunately.
leave, yeah.
Yeah,
I've
if
read
you have the
about
ability
some
to.
I've read about some of these towns on the East Coast that only have like 300 people left because the sea has pretty much swallowed them. You really sympathize with people, right? Especially people that have been here for generations. It's horrible that these people have to leave their home, especially for something that's largely not their fault at all. You know?
No, it's really is too bad because that there's certain climate disasters that happen that just happen. Like I mean, like in the sense that like there really isn't a whole lot that can be done about it. I think like tornadoes in the Midwest, for instance, they just pop up.
Yeah.
Like there's not really a whole lot that can be done to get out of the way of them or to prevent them.
Hmm.
But we know that these storms, with hurricanes in particular, are being strengthened from climate change. So our our inaction is making these things worse. Not saying that, if we reversed, carbon emissions, that hurricanes would go away, but they wouldn't be as devastating as they are right now.
Right. Wouldn't hurt.
No.
Yeah, regarding the Midwest, they're actually dealing with a little bit of climatic whiplash as well. They go through really extreme drought conditions and then extreme wet conditions. Back in 2020, there were huge swaths of the Midwest farmland that were destroyed in this storm, these powerful storms called derechos. It's a Spanish word for straight wind. Basically, you have these really intense windstorms that come through. They also have hurricane force winds behind them, torrential rains, thunderstorms, and it can even spawn tornadoes. And so back in 2020, there was one um, that impacted Iowa. And if you guys are listening to this podcast when it posts, look this up. Look up the Cedar Rapids Derecho 2020. It will blow your mind, the level of damage from the storm. And what I'm getting at is when I've examined the science with these storms, scientists have found that there's definitely a link between these extreme weather events and climate change. And so as we continue to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, storms like these, which are relatively infrequent now, are going to become not only more frequent, but much more intense. And so, like, what we're already seeing is pretty scary, considering that it's only expected to get worse. So I wanted to get to the article now, which is about connecting the dots between mass incarceration, health inequity, and climate change. So this is, I guess I should start by saying that Black, brown, and indigenous communities face the brunt of the climate crisis and at the same time are disproportionately incarcerated. So this article, written by Seth J. Prinz, he's an assistant professor of epidemiology and socio-medical science at Columbia. He talks about intersectionality here and the connection between mass incarceration and climate change and the public health crisis regarding lack of access to healthcare. So the article begins by pointing out that prison abolitionists and public health advocates have long made analogous arguments when they describe the fundamental causes of mass incarceration and health disparities as systems of extraction, exploitation, domination, racism, and heteropatriarchy. But mass incarceration, health inequity, and the climate emergency are all intertwined in more than an analogy and in ways that no single field can address on its own. So first of all, I guess, what do you think about that, Desmond? Do you agree with that take?
I mean, I think it's an obvious thing. You know, we talking about who ends up being the most incarcerated. It's a pretty straightforward line. You know, like when you talk about who ends up being in these prisons the most, it is the people who are in the most poverty because they're the most easily, I guess, like they're the most easily manipulated into this system. And when you think about who's in the most poverty, you think about people who are not white because those are the people who normally dominate these areas that are in the most poverty. Especially when you talk about in the inner cities, I know that people will scream that there's plenty of poverty in places like Appalachia and rural parts of America. That's also true, but you know, like disproportionately speaking, you know, it's undeniably urban areas in this country, the major cities. So it's basically a vicious cycle, right? Like you have minorities living in these areas and they have terrible like education systems. They have terrible lack of, you know, access for food. As far as food deserts are concerned, you have people who have terrible health care and people who grow up believing that they just don't really have a shot. And so like sometimes, you know, that will just lead to run-ins with law enforcement and they become easy targets. I saw this quite a bit growing up in the East Coast. I had friends who were in and out of like juvenile detention facilities, in and out of correctional facilities, being put in for the most ridiculous reasons, getting out, being put on probation, having to have, you know, these ridiculously like stringent things put around them that if they violated any one thing that can get put right back in, they lose another couple of years of their life. And then you basically have people who grow up in the system. And so when they come out, that's all they know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's absolutely insane just how the system itself breeds this cycle of exploitation. And there's a huge money rackets being made by it. You know, like the police are funded by a lot of this, the courts are funded by a lot of this, the prisons are funded by a lot of this. You know, and then you have also, you know, probably, I'm not sure if this is actually a good thing for them or not, but you have also like social workers who are funded by this because they're constantly in contact with these people, especially when we're talking about children.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the interconnectedness of all of these things is extreme. And so there's when I think about our current justice system, it feels as though it is constructed in large part to be a business, which is why you see things like mandatory minimums, extensive cash bail, just this, you know, school to prison pipeline that we see. It's obvious, you know, like what is designed to do, and it absolutely needs. I don't know what exactly it needs, but it needs a lot more attention than it's currently getting. And it definitely needs for people to wake up to basically the destruction that it causes on so many communities in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And we're going to definitely get to some of the major solutions that we think could be implemented to solve some of these issues, because they're definitely there. Just a
Yeah.
lot of it's largely ignored, unfortunately. So the text goes on to discuss the social relations of racial capitalism. And he says, quote, most incarcerated people come from a handful of neighborhoods, which is what you were getting at, primarily communities of color in major U.S. cities. Yet most new prisons are actually built in rural hinterlands. Both sets of spaces have experienced tremendous divestment over decades of deindustrialization, deregulation, and economic austerity. The result is, quote, organized abandonment, end quote, where poor communities of color with few jobs and crumbling transit and housing and poor rural landscapes, ecologically and economically devastated, first exploited and then abandoned by industry. After that, police flood the former with arrest quotas and the quality of life ordinances, while prison boosters descend on the latter, where they promise jobs via new correctional facilities, on former farmland or industrial properties. And at each end of the prison industrial complex, fragile communities and delicate ecologies bear the brunt of an expanded carceral infrastructure rather than investment, regeneration, and cultivation, which is exactly what you're talking about with the school to prison pipeline, for example. Regarding the direct connection between the climate crisis and mass incarceration, Prinz lays out the extractive and deeply psychologically damaging forces that the state engages in to prop up the prison industrial complex. So the article states that the extractions involved in forcibly removing residents from their neighborhoods to be warehoused in massive faraway high security institutions cause enormous injury to humans and habitats alike. These processes undermine the health and well-being of people of color, indigenous people, and migrants, the same groups that are then targeted by the criminal justice system as the state's favorite mode of crisis abatement. These same groups will also bear the greatest burdens of climate change, which, how perfect, right?
Yeah, no, it's the people with the least amount of power always seem to have to deal with the most amount of harm.
Yeah.
Right? Like our system, from top to bottom, it says that, like if you make it, which just means like if you end up becoming extremely wealthy, then you'll be taken care of. And if you don't, well, then, you basically have to deal with the repercussions of all of the all of the effects of our system, right? Like when you extract as much as we do from this planet without replenishing, we have this climate change, this climate crisis, and then who has to deal with the brunt of that? The people with the least.
Yep.
It's always the people with the least who have to deal with the after effects of basically our system that is constantly trying to get the most out of everything and not caring about what comes out on the other side.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And one of the things too is climate change is often looked at as like a futuristic issue. This is something that we need to think about in the future, right? But something that needs to be drilled home is that we have climate refugees right now. And the people that are having to flee their homes are largely people that are extremely poor in the global south, people that had nothing to do with climate change whatsoever. Regarding the climate crisis specifically, as far as the United States goes, um, white people are much more likely to benefit from cooling greenery than people of color. And during a summer 2019 heat wave, a New York utility intentionally cut power to a majority black neighborhood to avoid larger blackouts. At the same time, eco gentrification is displacing lower income residents of color with wealthier, typically white gentrifiers. And Prin goes on to say that this green affluence is misleading, even accounting for reductions in transportation or building energy emissions. Affluent residents use much less consumption by driving higher carbon footprints.
Yeah, God, you know what? I am seeing a lot of what you just said in the city that I live in right now.
Yeah.
Like I really am. It feels as though like the efforts to quote unquote like push towards sustainability here, they feel a little misguided. This might be getting a little off topic here, but I'm going to try to kind of like bring this back in. when it comes to talking about exploitation, for instance, talking about these poor communities being affected by these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right now in this community, we are dealing with a housing crisis like most places are. And due to that fact, the city is building apartments out the wazoo. They're building apartments everywhere. It's apartments, 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 apartments. A few condos, a couple townhouses, almost no single family homes. Now, the idea is that, one of the ideas around this is like, like a push for sustainability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on one hand, you could probably champion that idea. You're like, all right, if we have so many of these single family homes, you're just gonna have a bunch of people just like sprawled out endlessly. It's probably not the best thing for the environment. On the other hand, when you look at it, when you're having people basically just being stacked up in all these different apartments, what is that really, doing? If you're truly thinking about it, you're putting people basically into a market where almost their entire option when it comes to housing is a place that they have to rent.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to rent and they have to rent and they have to rent forever. You're a permanent renter in this community now. And as we know from plenty of, institutions that have studied this, there are numerous studies that show that the number one form of like wealth that you can generate for yourself in this country is through like home ownership.
Yeah.
And that has now been stripped away from most of the people in this community that I lived in for the sake of sustainability. And so now we have this like we're now creating this almost like permanent renter class where people are never going to be able to own their own home, which I find to be incredibly ironic, in a town that claims to be, run by people who champion the idea of housing being a human right. It seems a little inverted when you really think about it.
Yeah.
It's like you have the right to pay your landlord forever. So it just, I worry sometimes that when we talk about sustainability, that it will end up being hacked by the same people who have caused the problem in the first place. They'll just find another way to exploit people and to, find a way to profit off of the pain that they already caused. And so I think it's very important to look at how these solutions end up coming up in the sense of sustainability and when it comes to climate change, because, the solution could also just create another problem in and of itself.
Right. I think really what they're getting at here too is like the very obnoxious, egotistical white liberal that thinks they're doing everything right for the environment. So they'll just shit on somebody and say, "Oh, just get a Tesla, asshole. Then you won't have to worry about buying gas." It's like I can't
Yes.
afford one. I would love one.
Yes, because they're so cheap, and we
Yeah.
all are just we're all just rolling in money around here.
Why don't you
That's
just shop
exactly
at
what's
Whole
happening.
Foods? Stop going to Walmart.
Yes, again, wouldn't that be nice to be
Yeah.
able to do $400 grocery store runs whenever you want to?
Yeah, no shit. Yeah, I really see that as who the demographic that they're talking about here.
Yeah, we're seeing some of that happening here, where it's like they're changing the roads around here as well, in a sense where they're trying to well, I'll get to that at a different point. But anyway, it's some of the moves that are being made, they seem to be very not
Questionable.
well, questionable, and it seems to be misguided.
Mm,
Just in a way, it's like you're trying very hard to seem like you're doing the right thing, but not really like evaluating all the different repercussions that are going to come from it.
right. Yeah, so the article goes on to say that the rich benefit from luxurious adaptation and mitigation, while everybody else faces deteriorating environmental and social conditions. Displaced poor and working class residents end up on the street, incarcerated, or pushed further to the urban periphery. And if they do end up incarcerated, climate change directly threatens their health and safety. During Hurricane Katrina, those in the Orleans Parish prison were abandoned without power, food, water, or proper ventilation, and they were also found chest deep in water. During Hurricane Sandy, New York City didn't have an evacuation plan for Rikers Island, even though it was inside an evacuation zone. Carceral facilities, in addition, also cause direct environmental damage themselves. In Alabama in 2014, Donaldson Correctional Facility was found guilty of dumping over 800,000 gallons of sewage into nearby creeks. And then in Kentucky, this is a really positive thing. Local anti-prison activists and environmental groups actually blocked a new federal prison on the grounds that it would contaminate local watersheds, pollute the air, and threaten endangered wildlife habitats, which included a rare old-growth forest. Yeah, we'll give them a clap.
Definitely a good thing, especially given that part of the country where, we're not too far removed from Cancer Alley.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. That's fucking crazy, right? Like, no evacuation plan.
It only seems crazy given your own morality. When I think, unfortunately, we have this massive stigma still in the country that is like
With prisoners.
with prisoners, right? And I see it even amongst people who are liberal. And if people are liberal feel this way, like we don't even need to poll the conservatives as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, this idea that if you're in jail, your life basically has no value, or it doesn't matter what happens to you. I mean, I think John Oliver tried going over something like that when he did his piece on prison heat, when he would talk about just basically, like, again, the rise of climate change and how it's becoming hotter outside, which means like more perilous conditions for people who are in some of these facilities across the country who have no air conditioning and are sitting in these blocks of cement just being baked every day. Because we tell ourselves that these facilities are about rehabilitation. I think we know that they're not, but we claim that they are. You can't really rehabilitate someone that you're torturing.
Why are they more violent when they come out? It's so weird.
It's a pretty big cause and effect, right? And that's not even like getting into the issues that do happen when they do get out, talking about their inabilities to get jobs afterwards, having that on your record, stringent parole,
everything
restrictions
associated with recidivism.
They've almost completely eliminated people's abilities to get any kind of education while they're incarcerated. So I mean, like, people aren't going out and leaving with the idea that they don't want to go back in. It's almost like a guarantee they would go back in, which I think only furthers the statement I made before about it being a system designed to generate money.
Yeah, I mean, it was only until very recently where we were using prison labor in California to fight wildfires. And we had to pass a law. Governor Newsom finally did it, thankfully. But for a while, we were having prisoners fight wildfires, right? And they would receive all the same training as firefighters that are not incarcerated.
Yeah, and they would get paid like $1 an hour.
Yeah, and not only that, but since they had a prison record, even though they had all the proper training, the state wouldn't hire them as full-time firefighters. So we had to waste a bunch of money by hiring an entire new group of people instead of bringing people on that already had the qualifications. And so finally, Newsom passed a law where prisoners who receive all the training can now become firefighters. But that was only like in the last year. So for a very long time, that was a policy in place.
It's amazing to me that even in the most liberal state of California, that certain things like that still are just like, just like you're just inching towards progress. And that would seem like the most like obvious step to take. But even in like an entirely blue state, like something like that took until 2021 to become a law.
In California, we've built 23 prisons since 1980 and only 2 universities.
Well, that's your stat of the day now, isn't it?
That says it all, doesn't it?
Just a little bit. Yeah, it's I think when I look at because I know that I've heard you say this phrase before, and I've heard Erica say it now. When we look at our capitalist hellscape, it seems as though it's very obvious, where the, I guess, like the wealthy and the elite in this country want there to be concentrated forms of investment and where there will be no investments. And so there is definitely an intersectionality again between climate change and mass incarceration, because the people who find themselves in mass incarceration are also places that don't have the investment. And when we talk about climate change, it is from a lack of investment there as well. So unfortunately, what we're really up against when we talk about both of these things is an elite class of people in this country who just don't feel the need to invest into either one of these areas because they don't see any true value in helping the poor in this country or saving our environment.
Right? Absolutely. And I think this is actually a perfect point right now to segment into where we can talk about some of the solutions and the fundamental causes, like the way that we can tackle them. So the article goes on to say that despite the grave urgency we face, which is what we're alluding at right now, this is also a moment of unprecedented opportunity. Virtually all of the most ambitious proposals to tackle the climate emergency implicate fundamental social determinants of health. These include massive public investments to decarbonize the economy by 2030, the creation of millions of new jobs to achieve decarbonization and a just transition, targeted investments in environmental justice communities for decarbonization and adaptation, and fully funded social services such as universal health care and housing. These exact same measures also could be the route to decarceration and the elimination of health disparities in the US. In the 90s, when mass incarceration was accelerating, 1/3 of men sent to prison were unemployed. And today, the unemployment rate among formerly incarcerated people is 27%. Full employment based on the expansion of renewable energies, ecosystem restoration, expansion of social services, and major new public works can make a huge difference in the lives of people in or at risk for contact with the criminal justice system. Stable housing is a prerequisite for maintaining employment and enjoying decent physical and mental health. Yet people ensnared by the criminal justice system are systematically excluded from both private and public housing. Furthermore, they are at higher risk for numerous health problems that often require supportive housing, which can cost effectively reduce reincarceration rates. Feminism also ties heavily into this, right? We're talking about intersectionality. They found that feminist organizers make up the front lines of the prison abolition movement, in which Black women in particular lead the struggle for a new society as the struggle for decarcerated future. Similarly, around the world, women are already leading the fight against climate change, especially in the highest risk places. And according to the latest climate science modeling, feminist social help policies drive the deepest carbon emissions reductions and greater resiliency from extreme weather. I mean, I'm not surprised at all by that. Women are fucking badass.
No, I know that the few times that I've come across, prison abolitionists, whether online or in my real life, mostly all of them were women.
Yeah.
So that I guess that tracks with my anecdote, but yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And it is something that I'm still like, I'm still just learning about. I think my first interaction with this idea just came just last fall. Like, truthfully speaking, I had never even heard of someone mention prison abolition just until I think just last summer, last fall ish. So, but I've definitely seen a lot of value in the conversation. But I guess to put my cards on the table, when it comes to that subject in particular, there is a part of me that doesn't get completely on board with prison like abolition. I think where I sit at currently, just kind of like flesh out how I feel about it, is the amount of time that people are in jail is excessive and needs to be reduced. And I also think all the different reasons that we have people currently going to jail is excessive. It needs to be reduced. I would like to see less crimes being punishable by jail time. I like to see people spending less time in jail. I would like to see people actually getting real rehabilitation who do deserve to go to jail. And I would reserve that for like really big crimes. Like when I think about, like when I think about murder, when I think about, like rape, those are the things that come to mind. But again, like I think there also you have to have that paired with, just like better, just a better system overall, one that's like less rampant with corruption from top to bottom, including more of an investment in a lot of these areas where you constantly have people going into the prison system. Again, I'm talking about these urban areas where mostly minorities live. I think so many people fall into this system because of how exploited these areas of our country are. So it's not like a one area that you just focus on, like, oh, okay, well, let's just reduce mandatory minimums, or, oh, let's just, like make sure that people are getting rehabilitated when they're in jail. I think you have to focus on about like 10, 15, 20 different points all at once to really address this entire issue. But with that being said, I don't know that I can come on board for police or for prison abolition just yet. Because in my mind, when I think of, I guess when I think of someone like Derek Chauvin, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about what he did to George Floyd, like there's no part of my brain that can resonate with the idea that that person shouldn't be in jail. Like I don't have it in me. And so maybe someone can convince me down the line that I need to expand my ability to forgive, but I don't have it currently.
And fair enough. I'm a full-on anarchist, and I have questions about prison abolition myself. Something really interesting to dive into. And listeners, check out Ruth Wilson Gilmore too. She is a prison abolitionist and an anarcho-feminist, and you could find out a lot about that topic if you look up her name. She's written a few books on the subject as well. And also check out Angela Davis. She is an activist, Black woman, has been on the forefront of all things leftism for decades. She has marched with Fidel Castro. She stood with the Black Panthers. Like, you name it, she's been there. I think another major thing too, Desmond, that all of this is really circling around is the issue of defunding the police, right? Like, that's something that's only recently come to the mainstream, I guess I should say.
Yeah, the last couple of
But
years.
investing in communities is what we're talking about here. Divesting from the police. I mean, in Los Angeles alone, I think the police budget here is like $1.7 billion.
Wow.
And in 2020 alone, the statistics just came out about this. We had over 2,000 homeless people die on the streets in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I mean, we have our own issue with an unhoused population up here in Missoula. But yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say that Los Angeles has the biggest issue with this in the nation, and it sounds like it's been happening for a long time, from what I understand as well. It's not like a recent phenomenon there.
No, it's just getting worse. For sure. I think another important thing that we should talk about before we close this episode, do our plugs and all that, is political courage and mobilization, right? Like, we're not
Yeah,
going to be able to solve any of these issues if people just feel constantly defeated and that they just are going to stand on the sidelines. People have to feel
very true.
motivated. So, how do you think that we go about that as leftists to bring people into activism that, for the most part, feel really down and defeated by these institutions, which are so good at just burying people and making them feel weak and powerless?
Yeah, I this is something that I'm running up against with my own like audience, and honestly, just again putting cards on the table with myself. This current administration, the Biden administration, it has essentially, and I don't, I'm not going to say that it did this directly, but for, directly, indirectly, it has completely taken the air out of everyone's sails when it comes to political activism. Like when you measure, the appetite for people wanting to be involved politically, today versus a year ago versus a year before that versus the year before that, like even prior to the
Yeah.
pandemic, 2019, 2018, 2017, like it is I feel like I am in the year 2014 right now. Like that's what it feels like. It feels like we just like snapped back. And on one hand, it's understandable, right?
Hmm.
Like people are exhausted from dealing with coronavirus. People are exhausted from having dealt with Trump for 5 years. People are tired. So I get it. At the same time, like these issues exacerbate when we're not paying attention to them, because the fact of the matter is that our political system is completely corrupted by the people in this country who are profiting off of the current state of affairs in our country. The current economy, is completely, like it is completely, in design of the people who are, billionaires and like multi-millionaires in this country. They're thriving off the current system. They have bought influence in every level of politics. And without people staying engaged and demanding change, the status quo will maintain. It really will. And so I can understand that, like people can get frustrated, especially when you see people like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema blocking certain things, like on the federal level. But to get to the solution, I truly believe the solution is at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. In my own city, I have seen people get elected recently who were progressive, beating out establishment candidates, just like on my own like city council. And it honestly, it didn't take a massive effort. Like it really did. It just took like a few people organizing and getting together. I also think about what's happening in Rhode Island right now with their whole state like cooperative, where basically the progressive movement in Rhode Island has basically almost completely thrown out all the establishment Democrats in the state of Rhode Island in their state legislature. Like this can happen on the local level. And I truly believe that we need more people to get involved in your more local politics. Here's like a story just in particular.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wealthy, a wealthier person moved here from, I believe, from California, went to go buy a development in our downtown area. He bought the land for, I think, for $10 million, planned on putting up a bunch of like, like hotels, condos, retail space, and so on and so forth. The entire place was going to be valued around like 100 billion by the time he was done, or I'm sorry, 100 million by the time he was done with it. It caused a lot of controversy here in the city after the person who did it, in fact, went on social media and happened to kind of flaunt, the fact that he just moved here and just bought up a big piece of like our downtown area and was saying some nasty things to certain like, college students on social media.
Mm-hmm.
And it took only about 80 emails in a town where we have a population of like 120,000. It took 80 emails for the city council to revoke his right to build there. Well, they didn't like revoke it, but they've suspended it. So not really sure where that leaves it right there. But it was that little amounts of engagement actually was to actually stop this multimillionaire from being able to start building these luxury condos. So that's the small amount of like engagement that it would take to do something at a local level. I understand that some people live in bigger areas, but there are plenty of people who live in towns that are like 200,000 and less around this country, and you could probably do a lot of positive work in your own community if you just got a few people together and just made the effort. Like it seems insurmountable, but I'm telling you, in a lot of these local areas, it's really not. Like you really can do it.
Yeah, well said, man. Thank you so much for sharing that story. That's beautiful. I really like that. Yeah, and one thing that really kind of sticks with me too, that you've probably seen this meme. It's like, don't care about politics. Your boss does. Your landlord does.
On one hand, I get it though. Like
Yeah,
I do.
of
I
course.
mean, like,
It's easy, right? I mean, it's because it's so defeating. Like,
yeah. I mean, I go out to
it's
the
draining.
bar sometimes to play pool. I was in a pool league for a little while. And sometimes we would get into conversations about politics, like while we were just playing pool.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the people that I would end up talking to during these times, they were the people who were politically apathetic, the people who might not vote, or the people who just didn't vote. And I think through multiple conversations with multiple different people, the one thing that was consistent was that these people felt like they had no power. Like they were all tired of things being a problem, and they all saw the corruption for what it was, but they felt like they couldn't do anything about it. Not that
Mm-hmm.
they didn't want to, they felt like they couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's flipping that switch in our minds, I think is so important if anything is going to change, because truthfully speaking, we do have all of the power collectively. Individually, no. Collectively, yes.
Yeah.
And if we can harness that together, change can happen. And it really doesn't have to be thousands of people to do it, especially if you talk about, again, with your local politics.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that focusing on the federal level is a lost cause for the most part.
The federal level will eventually bend if enough local municipalities and states come together. I mean, you don't have to look any further than that and looking at medical, or not medical, but the legalization of marijuana, or even with the legalization of gay marriage just back in like what 2013 or 2015. I mean, it was like it was a state
2016.
by so it was a state by state thing,
Yeah.
and then eventually the federal government, or the Supreme Court rather, stepped in and just made it a nationwide thing. But I think that is the model that needs to be addressed going forward. If we can't change things on the federal level, we'll make them bend to what's happening in the states.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad that you brought up cannabis, because there was one point that I wanted to make in this, with regards to like restoring justice in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. These communities have largely been incarcerated because of cannabis,
Yes.
both possession and sale and all that. And if you look at the numbers, almost 80% of dispensaries that are currently in the United States are white owned.
Yeah, that makes sense. Not saying it should, but
No,
it makes
but
sense.
yeah, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
That absolutely has to change. And so I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah,
Desmond,
well, that honestly,
yeah,
unfortunately, that conversation is actually much bigger than just the cannabis industry, because it's the same thing that I remember being on a podcast last year, and we were talking about the fact that Michael Jordan was the only Black owner of a professional sports franchise, and the other two people who were on the podcast with me were like, "Oh, that needs to change." And I was like, "Well, yeah, but this is indicative of the problem that we have in America. Like, in order to own a sports franchise, you have to be a billionaire. There are either 6 or 7 Black billionaires in our country." And so what we were talking about is that the wealth in our community is so disproportionately low that there just aren't enough people who can even afford to do these things, like buying a major sports franchise. But then even coming back down to the dispensary level, it costs what, hundreds of thousands, if not over $1 million, to start one of these things in a lot of these communities.
Yeah, I think the latest numbers I saw were you needed at least $1 million.
Right. And so what this story actually highlights is the fact that it's the racial wealth gap. Once again, it's the fact that there's so many Black, Brown, Indigenous people who are not able to afford to open the dispensary because of the fact that they don't have the money to do it.
Yeah.
And so we could be like, yeah, well, that needs to change. But you're right. But it's deeper than that. It's like we have to address why it is, again, that there are so many people who look like me and other shades, who are unable to prosper in this country. And it can't be just as simple as, oh, we're too lazy, or we don't work hard enough, it's a bunch of crap. It really is. Yeah. And so when we talk about, again, I think the word that's been used a lot today is intersectionality. Like, why is it that so many people of color keep finding themselves being exploited by a system, and then later on can't even find a way to thrive in it? And, we get to have conservatives throw out the token example here, there, as a way to disprove that. But, statistics are statistics at the end of the day, which I think is, something, if I ever got a chance to talk to Ben Shapiro, I would probably just use his own phrase right back at him and just say that facts don't care about your feelings.
Yeah, exactly. Do you have anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Climate change can be addressed in a lot of different ways. I think this ties perfectly back in with political apathy. Climate change feels like such a massive conversation that I think that sometimes individuals can feel like they don't have the ability to do too much to affect it. Especially when you are struggling financially. We've spent a lot of time talking about the financial plights of people who are, living in urban areas, but people are struggling everywhere. I mean, white people are struggling too. Middle class is getting smaller. What is considered to be middle class is shrinking. People are struggling all over the country. And I think there's a lot of people who might want to do things that are more eco-friendly, but feel like they can't for one reason or another. I know that I've talked to people specifically who say things like this. And I think sometimes even the smallest gesture can make all the difference. I think, like, for instance, we bought like 7 reusable bags and I think they were like $1.50 a piece.
Hmm.
And now it kind of got annoying after a while, but getting into the habit of not using plastic bags anymore at the grocery store, I mean, that makes a big difference. I have a little like bed of soil on my little porch where I will throw some food scraps onto there. So it's like a semi compost deal going on there. But basically, the idea is that just knowing that, food waste is one of the major contributors to methane, which, again, massive greenhouse gas that is, causing so much devastation in our world right now. But there's just little things, like not buying, like maybe getting a water bottle, just drinking more water, not buying so many dispensable things, like that. There's just a bunch of different little ways that we can all make a difference that don't have to be super, super expensive. And so I think when people think about the climate crisis and maybe feeling powerless, I'm sure that there are small ways, like cheap ways that we can make a dent in this. And if we all did these things collectively, it'll make a difference. Like obviously the pressure should be put most on these massive polluting corporations. And I'm not saying that they don't deserve most of the blame here, but I also think it is pertinent and important that we all do what we can, even on the smallest level, on top of asking these big corporations to change their ways as well.
Yeah, I really like that. On the left, there's this phrase that we often use where there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. However, if you can consume ethically, you should, which ties back to what we were talking about where, if you have the means to move out of somewhere that's ravaged ecologically, you absolutely should. That's not to say that everybody can. Of course, not everybody can.
No.
But if you are able to, you should.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is, we can talk about what the system should look like, and I feel like that's always what we should do. But at the same time, you have to also juxtapose that with where we are,
Yeah,
and where
it's
we are is in
prescriptive
this
versus
system.
descriptive.
Yeah, we are in this system, and so it's very important to try to like make the most of the situation that we're currently in while also striving for change.
Right. Desmond, do you want to plug your podcast? How can my listeners get in contact with you? And what do you have going on in the future as far as your show goes?
Sure. Thank you again for having me on. The podcast is called Independent Thought. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, basically anywhere that you would look for a podcast. I listen to my podcast on Castbox. Why? Just don't ask. I just like Castbox. I also have some stuff on YouTube. You can mostly find me on social media on Instagram and Twitter, preferably Instagram. That's where I spend more of my time. And as far as what's coming up, kind of a changing of the podcast a little bit is in store right now. So I typically how I've laid out the podcast in the past is we would have like an hour long episode where I would have my main topic and then my guest and then just some like afterthoughts about the conversation. But now switching it up, instead of having one long episode a week, I think I'm going to start doing 3 shorter episodes a week, which should be, I'm hoping that, kind of like as people are, kind of going back into quote unquote normal, and everyone has less time, I'm hoping that this shorter format will be more conducive for certain people. So, yeah, but we're not going to change the type of content that comes on the podcast, talking about whatever issues come up. Some of the things we talked about last season were geothermal energy, which I think more people really need to be looking at, especially when we're talking about climate change and some of the solutions that should be in the mix that are not currently in the mix. We took some time to talk about what happened with the Boy Scouts of America and all of the people who were abused under that organization and how they've been able to basically skirt under the radar and no one really knows just how horrific they were for decades. And it boggles my mind that more people still don't know. And also our drone strike policy over in the Middle East, because I think that enough people don't really have a grasp of just how truly devastating we have been over in those Middle Eastern countries for the last couple of decades. And I think more people need to be speaking up about, what it means to actually, well, liberate countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Listeners, definitely check out the Independent Thought podcast. Desmond puts a lot of hard effort and soul into each and every one of his episodes. He also has fantastic guests, and Independent Thought is definitely a sister podcast here, so please check them out. 805 Uncensored, as always, is on YouTube. We're at 805 Uncensored Podcast. We're on Instagram at 805 Uncensored Pod. Also on Twitter at 805 Uncensored. Thank you so much, Desmond, again for being here. And I hope you have a great one.
Thank you.